Jesus Christ, this game kinda sunk a company. And I mean, I would have assumed that the well of outrage at release, followed only by general apathy from the gaming world, was a pretty bad omen, but I wouldn't have predicted it all based on my initial experience with the game. I definitely didn't adore it, especially considering I played it early enough to experience the stuttering hellscape that it was before the first patch. I actually didn't even finish that initial playthrough before I got distracted by something else, probably Elden Ring again, and just kind of forgot about it entirely. But I considered my time with the game to be reasonably good. I just wasn't grabbed by the story and got to a point where I kind of felt like I had experienced enough to get the idea. Meanwhile, Glenn and the gang at striking distance were in total fucking panic damage control mode over the next several months, only to be rewarded with mass layoffs, including the stepping down of the top brass once the player experience was smoothed out and the promised DLC had been finished. And that's kind of rough, but it's also a reality of the industry when a game this expensive to make flops as hard as this did. So fast forward over 18 months later, after many updates bringing performance improvements, quality of life features, and even some changes to the fundamental feel of the game, all of the DLC, which I apparently paid for, has been released, and the game has recently been added to Game Pass, maybe getting enough money out of Farmer Bill to finally turn a profit. Probably not, though. And after not thinking about the Callisto protocol at all for about a year and a half, I decided to start a new playthrough. And, I was bugging pretty hard back in 22. This game fucking rocks. Kind of. And I don't really know what fan of survival or action horror wouldn't consider it worth at least some of their time, especially if you have access to Game Pass. With that said, it's obviously pretty far from a perfect game, and I do think a lot of my enjoyment stems from my personal biases, so I'll try to be fair and balanced as I break things down. I'll save the story details for the end, so you have a while before you need to worry about spoilers. Hey everyone. Quick editor's note here. I had a bit of a sniffle while I was doing this voiceover. My voice actually kept going out, and I had to do a substantial number of retakes, so the sound, and to a lesser extent the volume of my voice, will shift around a few times. So if you notice that I randomly start to sound like a fucking finger crone or a chain smoker, just ignore it. It shouldn't be too distracting, and everything should turn out just fine. Alright. Editor's note over. Now, an important thing to keep in mind is that while I experienced the game's day one issues, this is strictly a review of the game in its current state. I can barely remember my own fucking birthday, so it's probably not a good idea for me to tell you what a game was like a year and a half ago. With that said, I think the easiest topic to get out of the way is the visual and audio side of the game on a technical level. Once performance was fixed, I think pretty much any criticism of the game's look and sound became unwarranted. On the right hardware, this game is still outclassing new releases in that department and will probably continue to do so for some time. If you've listened to Glenn talk for more than 30 seconds, you've probably gotten the idea that he is a giant fucking nerd about this aspect of development in particular, and he believes it to be one of the most important pieces of a game. So that, coupled with Callisto's high development costs, make good visuals and consistently immersive sound something of a foregone conclusion. Now maybe that's a catalyst for a conversation about whether some of the spent resources that make the game technically immaculate could have been better utilized elsewhere, but as someone who's happy with the final product, I'm not too worried about it. But to get more specific, the game runs exceptionally well on 9th generation consoles at this point. And that's in either the 60 FPS performance mode or the 30 FPS quality mode, with the ray tracing and those other resource-intensive features. I'll admit to you now that I barely fucking notice the difference between the two. I'm about the furthest possible thing from a graphics or visual snob myself. Playing Bloodborne at 25 FPS on my dying PS4 doesn't really bother me at all, so there could very well be blemishes across the board that I don't pick up on, but I don't think we need to worry about it. On PC is a slightly different story. Now I have some pretty underwhelming specs to say the least, but I do meet the game's minimum requirements and can run it while putting up with some frame drops here and there. The only additional bug I've run into on PC is this issue where item pickups, particularly health items, will occasionally glitch into the floor or deactivate, becoming impossible to grab. I don't know if this is something that a lot of you have experienced, but while it is annoying, I consider it a pretty minor thing. Now, the footage you'll see throughout the video came from my PC and not my Xbox, so that's why you might have noticed the game doesn't look as amazing as I've said it can. But if nothing else, this might give you an idea of how your game will perform if you have a similarly mid-range desktop. I do want to point out that the game has benchmark and performance tests that you can run from the main menu on PC, which is always nice to see, but I don't think they're very fine-tuned in Callisto's case. I say that because the benchmark told me I should run the game at 60 FPS on high settings, and that would be fine if I wanted it to look like a fucking claymation, not to mention the constant frame drops, but it's generally just not that practical. I actually need to run it at 30 FPS on medium settings to have a decent experience. Again, I'm not complaining because I know my specs are below what most new games require. I just think the program is a little too generous with these estimates. Now onto the game world proper. The setting is Black Iron Prison and the mining colony buried beneath it, located on, you guessed it, Callisto, which is one of Jupiter's moons. It's roughly 300 years in the future, and just like its spiritual predecessor Dead Space, it's a very unglamorous, nuts and bolts kind of science fiction setting, which I definitely have a positive disposition towards. It's one of the things I loved about the Ishimura, how recognizable and practical the setting still felt despite the game's more outlandish aspects. And Callisto honestly keeps things even more grounded in many ways. You can tell they went through a lot of work to maintain the feeling that the prison is this massive, faltering machine in the middle of a deeply hostile environment. Now, that's not to say that they were striving for pure realism or anything, because the game is actually pretty campy and bombastic in some aspects, with things like the massive exposed gears and grindy bits in areas where people are meant to be walking, or the insane death traps set up to catch escaping prisoners. This thing in the garden area has to be my favorite. You throw an enemy into the gears and it mushes them up, then sprays them all over the area. There is absolutely no reason that that needs to work that way. And there's something about seeing what is, in almost every way, a carefully crafted and completely practical environment being turned into this haunted house thrill ride for the sake of having fun with the genre that scratches an itch for me. It's some tumultuous balance between the oppressive and fully realized setting of a game like Amnesia the Bunker and the wacky horror bullshit fiesta of games like The Evil Within. I don't think anyone can say this game doesn't have a sense of humor. But different players are looking for different things. I can understand how someone wanting to experience one or the other would look at the Callisto Protocol and think it's a mess that fails on both fronts. That's a personal preference thing. I'll let you decide whether it suits you. Now, as far as how the player progresses through the world, this is a largely linear experience, but with a surprising amount of completely optional side areas. These zones get smaller and less frequent in the game's more focused second half, but I was really intrigued during my playthrough by how the devs built these levels and handled player objectives. There's no quest marker or minimap, and you're usually given a general idea of what you need to accomplish in order to proceed before being presented with a sprawling area. Where I think the game deserves a lot of credit is in how the optional wings and rooms of the prison that a lot of players will walk right past don't feel like phoned-in side content at all. A decent little amount of the game's unique set pieces and encounters are in these side areas. Not usually hidden from you, but not calling attention to themselves either. It makes Callisto feel like a genuine world gone to shit that you have to explore to find your path through. Even back in the day, I remember being amazed when people listed it as a negative, that you often don't know if you're on the intended path or exploring some offshoot zone, because there's usually no initial indicator of which is which and no difference in quality between the two. Because how is that not phenomenal world design? I mean, we're currently in the era of people getting up in arms over yellow paint telling them exactly where to go, and fair enough, but I don't feel like I'm seeing enough love for game design that does respect the player's intuition and sense of discovery. But I won't drag on that point. While the layout of the world and a couple other gameplay features give the game just a twang of survival horror design, like just enough to be recognizable, like Dead Space before it, it's more focused on the combat and exploration than, say, puzzles. Because this game has zero puzzles, unless you consider finding the fuse and placing it in the fuse-shaped hole near a door to be a puzzle, in which case it has a lot of puzzles. Now, I don't think a little more mental exercise would have hurt the experience, it probably would have enhanced it, but I also didn't mind the game letting exploration be the star. In that same vein, it's not a pick-your-battle sort of experience either. There are very few instances throughout the game where avoiding conflict or fleeing an encounter is the smart thing to do. You should basically kill every scary thing you see. Even the stealth sections after the very first one feel like they're best handled by systematically killing everything in your path rather than sneaking around them. But more on those in a minute, because I think we're finally ready to talk about the core gameplay. Our hero Jacob feels heavy to control. There's no action in this game that lacks a sense of weight. While he's pretty fucking handy with a blunt object and swings it with some grace, every impact feels like a labored event. And on the occasions where you swing and miss, you're counting the milliseconds it takes to recover and reset. Most of your actions, healing in particular, are done in a slow and measured way, which inherently serves as a stressor given how aggressive the standard enemies appear. Combine that with the claustrophobic position they chose to place the camera and the very minimal HUD meant to keep you immersed, and we've got something that feels like a decent horror game. It's not that you feel weak, the game makes it pretty clear that you're more than capable of killing everything in your way. It's that the gameplay at a fundamental level is framed to make you feel overwhelmed. And I learned after writing that line that that was one of the developers' explicitly stated goals. So, good job everyone. Now in second-to-second combat, this is a melee-focused game, especially in the first third or so. And holy fucking shit, do people love to hate this melee combat. And I get it, it's weird at first. It's pretty far from being flawless. Dodges don't actually have to be timed, you just hold the stick or key either left or right, then begin holding it the other way before the next attack comes. Attack them once their combo is done, rinse and repeat. There's also a perfect dodge mechanic that ends an enemy's attack combo early when executed and lets you get a swing or a weak point shot off before they start up again. It's pretty slick in one-on-one fights, but if you're being surrounded, then you'll get smacked by the next guy before you can take full advantage a lot of the time, so it's definitely a situational tool. And also, how you execute the perfect dodge is scuffed as all shit. I'll break this down because the game has been out for quite a while and a ton of people are still confused by it. So, gamer intuition tells you that to pull off a perfect dodge, you'd want to dodge the attack at the last possible second. This does not work. Then people started constantly tapping the stick in one direction instead of holding it, and this works better, but it's still not completely reliable. The reality is that it has nothing to do with timing. It's all about tapping the key or flicking the stick very quickly. In fact, doing it too late often makes the input register as a normal dodge, so you're better off quickly flicking the stick right as the enemy is beginning their attack, and just waiting. Which is super weird. And because the perfect dodge isn't some broken, powerful maneuver like a Dark Souls parry or something, I actually think it makes a lot of sense to make it easy to pull off, but the input just feels bizarre, and I don't know what they gain by not actually telling anyone how it works. But there you go, if you never figured that bullshit out. The name of the game is reading the enemy combo and reacting in full force once your window appears, while keeping an eye on any other baddies in the area. Enemy attacks will range from a single swipe all the way up to a 5-hit combo, with minor variations in their tells across them all. Most people will tell you it's not very hard, and they are completely right, but there is a little nuance to it. Your window to retaliate once an enemy combo ends often isn't very long, and gets shorter the more enemies that are around, so if you're caught waiting for their next attack, you probably just missed your chance to swing without taking a hit. On the other end, if you open yourself up and try to swing before their combo is properly finished because you misread its L, expect to get bitched down. And I think the trade-off for having such a simple combat system is that even on the middle of the road difficulty, failure is pretty goddamn punishing, and healing during a fight is all but impossible. Simple, almost rhythmic combat loops have a habit of getting us into a rhythm naturally, and in this case, being violently ripped out of that rhythm can create a slippery slope that ends with a pair of thumbs in your fucking eye holes, which is not where we want those. When it comes to your guns, their best uses on a first playthrough are getting enemies to stagger or targeting their tentacles and weak points. Standard mobs often grow these little tendril patches in the middle of the fight, and if you don't destroy them pretty quickly, then the enemy powers up and undoes all your hard work. So guns get to see a lot of use as a sort of accent to your melee combos, while their functionality as an actual ranged weapon, outside of the riot gun and the late game assault rifle, is limited because ammo doesn't exactly fall from the sky, and most of them don't do great damage anyway. But while the stick is probably your most reliable weapon, the arguably most powerful is the grip. It's Kinesis from Dead Space, except while Kinesis was designed in the lore for construction crews to more easily move large equipment, the grip was designed solely for the purpose of human rights violations. So while the former can't grab entire enemy bodies and bitch them into a wall of spikes, the grip can. Especially before the update that made enemies a little more patient, grip was borderline essential to thinning the herd and giving you some breathing room, and it's still an insanely powerful tool on the current patch. But what really brings flavor to any enemy encounter is the enemies, how they mesh, how they're utilized. And meshing is something I wish the game did more of, give us fucked up combinations of enemies that make us panic and screw up. If you ask me, they don't do it nearly enough in the base game, probably because it's a horror game, and if you didn't know, horror games don't actually want you to die very much. But at any rate, let's break these down and see what we're working with. As the name would suggest, grunts are the standard infected. They come in both emaciated and husky flavor, and are known to rush and slap at you. While fighting one is never all that interesting, their combos and animations do become more complex as the night pushes on, and their real strength is in overwhelming you with numbers. They're the obstacle that the core combat is built around, and given that this is a very passable but unexceptional combat system, I think it's only right to grade them at a C. Next up are the Big Mouths. Larger and stronger infected who prefer to keep some distance and spit acid at you from afar. They're also known to spread the infection through the tentacles that come out of their throats. And these guys do a good job at mixing the combat up just as you're feeling comfortable taking on a pack of grunts. Their ranged attacks are a constant threat, forcing you to either stay on the move or target them first with firearms while risking grunt interference. One or two good shots in their head will break their acid spitter, at which point they'll close distance with you and start acting a lot like a grunt. All in all, they introduce some much needed variety to combat encounters, but they're not really doing anything too interesting, for which I award them a B-. After that, we gotta talk about bloodworms. And these can barely be considered a proper enemy. They're a lot more like an environmental obstacle, but they're living beings that attack you, so I think they narrowly squeeze into the category. Essentially, long neck hid inside an egg and got even longer. If you get within 10 or so feet, a nearly unavoidable face shoots out and latches onto you, trying to drag you back into its lair. You then button mash until you cut its head off. If you're perceptive, you can spot the egg ahead of time and shoot it to save yourself the trouble, but they look more or less identical to a lot of other eggs that don't spawn bloodworms, so I usually don't bother guessing. I think it's probably kind of telling that people hated these at release, so the devs took like half of them out of the game in the next update without a second thought. They're stupid. But on a small number of occasions, mostly in the DLC, they do get a little cheekier with bloodworm placements, spawning them in open rooms where the eggs actually stand out alongside other enemies, so you're actually rewarded for being observant and taking them out early before they fuck you over. I kind of wish they were only used in this way and not as goofy goober ass jump scares. Also, I kind of like the design. I think it's good body horror, even if they're silly as all hell. So, D-. Next up are the security bots. And before you have access to the pistol, these guys are presented as unstoppable killing machines. One of them serves as your stealth tutorial because being caught by them is instant death. Then you get your GAT and realize that 3 or 4 clean shots to the head will put one down. And I guess it's good game design to actively show a player that they've become more powerful, even in this highly unremarkable context, but they're just not super interesting to battle. They'll still insta-kill you if they catch you in the open, so you have to pop in and out of cover and pop them in the head as fast as you can. Once you have a feel for it, it's about as easy as taking down a couple grunts. And I know I've made a similar point a couple times already, but I just wish they'd done more interesting things with the bots and some other enemies. Like, I don't know, an encounter where a bot is pitted against a swarm of biophages, and we have to decide whether the immediate benefit of keeping it alive is worth future risk, or worth losing the valuable resource that they drop when killed. As it stands, every bot is their own solo mini-boss encounter, and they just don't really shine in that context, but there's nothing terrible about them either, so I'm thinking D. Next up is parasites. They jump out of boxes onto you, or can be seen squirming along the ground in packs. One shot from the pistol can kill 2 or even 3 at once if they choose to ignore social distancing guidelines, and if you get lucky with your timing, you might be able to whack or stomp on them. Really, their purpose is to annoy you until you say fuck it and waste the ammo on them. So they're a lot like the annoying crawly things from Dead Space, except you don't have a flamethrower this time. Let's go with F+. Next up, we have the Rusher. These guys specialize in surprise attacks and tactically rerouting by crawling all over the walls and ceilings or just straight up turning invisible. But if you position yourself somewhere that's impossible to surround or sneak to, you often force them to just bum rush right at you with their goofy ass legs. And I like these guys. They're kinda squishy, only taking a couple blasts from the riot gun to put down, but because they tend to move in packs and can attack from anywhere, they keep the player on their toes. Overall, I really like what they bring to the game, but there's not a whole lot more to say about them. Solid B. Next up are the Danglers. I didn't fucking name them, I'm just working with what I have. These are like tickers from Gears of War, or one of the 100 other kamikaze creatures that have been featured in games. On a purely aesthetic front, I think they're another really solid bit of body horror. Whereas most of the enemies are designed to look menacing, these guys feel genuinely tragic. There are few fates that I can think of which would be more degrading for what was once a human being than this. Now on a gameplay front, one option is to shoot them before they get too close. The better option is to grip them and fling them into other enemies for big damage. Just make sure they don't land too close. This is fun, and the devs knew this was fun because, spoiler alert, they're even used in the final boss fight. Simple but effective design. I'm gonna grade these babies way up at an A-. And now it's time for the blind. Big shocker, they don't see so good, so they're hypersensitive to any noise. And the stretch of game where they are the main focus strongly encourages stealth. And I kinda liked this. A lot of the encounters feel pretty tense to navigate through, and the very expensive sound design of the game really shines through. I seem to remember around the game's release, despite the number of actually real issues it had, a lot of reviewers were like severely critical of the fact that the sneak takedown animation is rather loud. So the rest of the blind should theoretically be able to hear you, even though in-game they can't. And that's something that every player will notice and probably be mildly amused by, but my mind boggles at the idea that anyone would actually give a fuck. Like, is that really the thing that killed your immersion? But I think I've kind of flown off topic. The portion of the game where the blind are the main enemy does start to feel like it's dragging on quite a bit in the last quarter or so. Seeing as how there's only so many things you can do to spice up such a straightforward gimmick, but it was over before I was actively annoyed with it. So I'm gonna give these guys a B+. I think they really shined in their section. Getting close to the end now, it's time to talk about Two Head. These guys serve as boss and mini-boss encounters throughout the game's last half, and their function from a game design perspective is essentially to be a toll booth that you pay 3/4 of your ammo to in order to proceed. Because of the way that dodging their attacks throws you off balance, you only really have the time for a single whack before their combo starts up again, and even getting that one hit in can be risky. So the best strategy is maintaining distance and aiming your guns at his heads until you can stagger him and move in for big damage. Not exactly riveting on the mechanic side of things, I'm sure you've noticed the trend, but they serve their purpose of wasting your ammo and being an enemy that you're worried about having to engage with. In a lot of ways, I guess they're like an old school survival horror boss, seeing as how most of those are pretty rough and serve only to waste resources too. And a closing note, the little animation he does at the halfway point after you destroy one head and he just rips the dead side off is pretty gnarly. It's kind of insane, very menacing. I'm gonna give this guy a C-. And now we land in some very minor spoiler territory, so skip to the time on screen if you care, because the final base game enemy to consider is one Captain Leon Ferris. And we'll talk about him more in the story section, but I do want to give you a feel for him here because he's probably my favorite character in the game, and that does bolster his goofy boss encounters. It can't do much to fix how absolutely fucking absurd this character design is, but let's not linger there. So, before his HGH transformation at least, he's played by the wonderful Sam Witwer, who some of you might remember as Starkiller, or like a dozen other Star Wars characters. Cue the footage.
You've taken everything from me!
Your feelings for her are not real.
They are real to me!
And he also portrayed Deacon in Days Gone, if you're one of the 8 people who gives a fuck about that game. My buddy Mr. Grinch actually did a playthrough of it on his channel. You should definitely check it out. Anyway, here, Sam just brings such a strong dose of personality to the villain by circumstance just trying to do my job archetype. I'll show you what I mean.
You. How the fuck did you get in here? You think I got time for this shit? Okay, let me see if I got this straight. You crash here, and then this whole place goes to shit. Oh, 5, 2, 1. Look at me when I'm talking to you. What'd you do? Huh? You can tell me. Are you different? Are you special?
And I just wish we got more of him in his normal human form. Maybe an actual fight instead of a fucking cutscene. But there's no sense talking about what could have been, let's just discuss what is. What's nice about Ferris's first boss form is that he's aggressive and hits like a bus, but doesn't take away your melee effectiveness like a 2-head. And Jacob is kind of forced throughout the game to fight at whatever tempo his enemies do. So Ferris, being incredibly fast and aggressive, allows his fights to have a fitting degree of intensity, where melee and ranged attacks both have a valuable place. In his final form, the Alpha, as it's known, that kind of goes away and we move back towards a slightly more complex 2-head style of fight, except the Danglers come in, and you can use them to blow away his defenses and put him down with style. Now, you've probably noticed that I hardly think the game's combat encounters are mechanically riveting, but relative to the rest of the package, I think Ferris's bouts are all really strong. And so, controversial as it may be, just kidding, no one gives a shit, I'm gonna grade him at an A, no plus. With all that, if you're looking at the grades, you're probably thinking, that adds up to a GPA that would have every military recruiter in the area very excited. I thought you said this game was good. And I do think it's good, but that also has a lot to do with what they've built around the second-to-second combat. I think the inventory and gear progression in particular were balanced out really well and end up being a huge boon to the experience. While only having 6 inventory slots for the first few hours of the game does create tension and inevitably lead to valuable items being left behind on a regular basis, it doesn't end up being as punishing as the limited inventory of a more strictly survival horror game typically is. You have to weigh the benefit of immediate health or ammo against the future benefit provided by valuable scrap and things like that. But then, things like key items and weapons don't even use up inventory space, and items of all kinds drop consistently enough that you're rarely ever feeling actually endangered on that front. Glenn and the boys do this cheeky little thing shortly after you get your upgraded suit and double your inventory space though. It's obviously a massive relief at first, but then you go through a considerable stretch of game shortly after where Jacob has no access to a store, and the game starts throwing valuable pickups at you. And it clicked for me once my inventory was getting full with future money that the game wasn't actually being nice. And all the valuables you find in that section are meant to go towards gear upgrades in order to have you sufficiently powered for the mid to late game spike in combat intensity. So the upgraded inventory lands you in the exact same spot you've been in, just with higher stakes. And that felt like a good little piece of classic design, turning something that should be a reward into something stressful almost immediately. Unfortunately, they don't keep that same energy throughout the rest of the game, as stores, while sometimes found off the beaten path, become a regular occurrence again. And I think all this makes sense given that this is a super combat heavy experience, but it again lands the game in a position to only please a small niche of us. If you bought the game hoping for something completely in the action horror vein, the inventory size is only going to annoy you, and if you only really like tense survival horror design, you're probably going to feel that it doesn't do nearly enough to actually be effective. But if you're happy with just a slice of that tension that inventory management provides, without it necessarily having to be a constant stressor that bleeds into every aspect of the gameplay, you're probably going to think they nailed what they were going for. And those of us who do think that, I'm getting the feeling we're the minority, and I 100% see why. It's another completely subjective sort of thing. Now when it comes to gear upgrades, and dear fucking God, Glenn, did you guys know that despite being paced perfectly to encourage a second playthrough, Callisto actually launched without a New Game Plus mode? And of every non-technical criticism that the game received at launch, this is the one that I most fully understand and agree with, even though it's rather minor in the grand scheme of the game's early problems. Because out of the 7 upgradable weapons that Jacob will get his hands on, you will maybe end the game with 3 of them fully upgraded. More likely 2 and some change. And the game doesn't set you up to believe otherwise. It's pretty clear that we're dealing with a tight economy here, and that upgrades should be chosen with care. A more curious player might spread upgrades out across all their weapons, finishing with a wider assortment of less powerful gear. Totally valid way to play and experience the different flavors of the game. Have fun. Personally, I'm way too anxious for that shit, so I go for the tried and true min-maxing of the essentials. And if you've got a gamer brain, which, seeing as how you're this far into this video, I'll assume you do, you'll probably pick up on the detail that you only ever find ammo for the weapons that you already have. Which means less ammo of any one type the more weapons that you craft. And if you build a gun, then find it doesn't suit you, those ammo drops are still diluting the pool and taking away kill juice from the ones you do like. So in this case, less is quite literally more. But realistically, the impact on your experience from these choices is only really noticeable on the higher difficulties anyway, so don't take anything I say as being actually important to your experience. I'm just a fucking guy with a microphone. But any game that gets me this worked up about gear progression is doing something okay in my book. Anyway, I don't think there's anything left to say that you can't sort of piece out from just looking at the gameplay, so I suppose it's time to tackle the narrative. Rampant spoilers ahead. So they swing for the dramatic opening. We're looking at the aftermath of what appears to have been some kind of chemical attack on a large city located on the moon Europa. There's only one living person seen on the security camera footage of the incident, a member of what the media has dubbed a terrorist group. Very not good. But Jacob isn't stressing about it because he's about to finish a big job and secure a big bag. He and his buddy Max are freelance cargo haulers, and they gotta make a delivery to Black Iron Prison. Unlike Jacob, Max is nervous about the job and the cargo for reasons that aren't entirely clear, so they bicker at each other for a couple minutes before Jacob goes to investigate the back of the ship and notices that they've been boarded. and boarded by that fucking terrorist broad from the TV, no less. Jacob tries to launch them out the back of the ship, but this panel of glass isn't bulletproof because the future is just as stupid as the now, so the terrorist causes the entire ship to crash land on Callisto, killing Max, who uses his final moments to guilt trip his best friend. But we still haven't seen that title card yet, because Captain Ferris has to show up with his scary robots to save the day. And he definitely doesn't show much sympathy towards the morning pilot, but there's nothing malicious about him either. Again, he just seems like a guy who wants to get through his shift and deal with this minor inconvenience. To nobody's surprise, the terrorist girl survived as well. The armed insurgents that were with her are never mentioned again, so I'll assume they all died because they lacked plot armor. Anyway, the real twist comes when Ferris gets a call from the prison's warden and is told to apprehend and process Jacob alongside the girl. Jacob's upset about it, but you can't really argue with giant fucked off robot, so he's getting marched inside. And then we get our title card. I don't think it's a bad game intro by any stretch. It establishes half of the game's important characters, raises some questions about them alongside the other big mysteries, and it's just kind of permeated with this uncaring, cold feeling that seems to be a slice of what this world is like as a whole. You'll also notice immediately how much of the game's budget went towards some very good face and motion capture and the actors that are being captured. Again, was this the best way for them to spend probably a shitload of money? I'll let you guys decide. Once the title card is over, we're back in cutscenes, which serve to establish the very Tony Todd-esque warden as a pompous psychopath, and flip a major switch for Ferris's character. Because the second that the warden labeled Jacob an inmate, he goes from being just a normal, small-talk-making guy to being a complete menace.
It's been a mistake. My name is Jacob Lee. I'm not an inmate.
You were inmate 532-521. You address me as Captain Ferris.
What? No. I'm just a cargo pilot. I was attacked by the Outer Way. By her. She crashed my ship and she killed my first officer.
I don't care. Warden's orders.
I think this does the simple job of showing how he, and probably a large percentage of his guards and other staff, completely dehumanize Black Iron's inmates. A point that's driven home moments later when Jacob is strapped down and a licensed medical doctor drives the game's health bar into the back of his skull. Which straight up fucking kills him, by the way, before he's resuscitated. Then he's in his cell having a bad dream, and he's the victim of a very silly jump scare by dead friend Max because he's got trauma going on or something. And this is the point where I'll stop with the play-by-play and we can just kind of talk generally, because there's about to be a massive biophage outbreak in the prison, followed by a handful of escape attempts, and things are really gonna go off the rails, but the narrative focus throughout the vast majority of the game is always on Jacob's immediate situation and concerns rather than anything we'd consider big picture. And fittingly so, I would say, because why would he initially care about anything but getting the fuck out of here? So I kind of want to break the writing down into two main components to look at separately, the main narrative and the character writing. And I'll start with the latter because it's probably what surprised me the most and the thing that I'm still not entirely sure how to feel about. I describe the character writing as simple but reasonably effective. We've already gotten the feel for Jacob as this kind of unassuming worker bee typical guy. He's not in the mood to overanalyze, but he's a quick thinker when he needs to be. Hardly a fascinating protagonist on his own, but after the complete collapse of the prison, he teams up with fellow inmate Elias, who has a plan to get them both out. And Elias is not an inherently super interesting character either. I'll spoil it, no one in the game is. But being the older of the two, he does radiate this mild kind of jailbird wisdom, and he places a lot of emphasis on personal accountability, which is something that Jacob lacks to an extent. And the two forming a hasty friendship as a result of severe hardship is a tale as old as stories themselves. There's probably cave paintings about that shit. Because I think that simple, highly relatable narrative will always be engaging to the common man as long as the characters are even remotely empathetic. which I think they pull off. I mean, who doesn't want to see a couple typical, albeit highly lethal guys overcome a terrible situation that they don't really deserve to be in? Assholes is the answer. So that's really the first half of the game, pretty much. Elias hatches plans and opens paths, while Jacob does grunt work and moves the duo closer to escape. Environmental storytelling and audio pickups fill most of the void while the two are apart, but there are some big character interactions that pop up. The first is Jacob's next interaction with Ferris, which you've seen a clip from, where Jacob gets the upper hand and attempts to kill him with biophages. The next is when Elias realizes he needs to free an inmate with the credentials to call an escape ship down from orbit, and the inmate ends up being the terrorist girl. Her name is Danny, by the way, and she is not actually a terrorist. What a relief. I mean, she did illegally board a government-contracted ship with violent intent, and directly caused the death of at least one person, so it's iffy, but she's not the really bad kind that the corporate overlords want to suggest. I mean, terrorist is just a word anyway, right? But to get back on track, Danny basically tells the boys that she won't help them, even though they set her free, and she's gonna do things her way. I know, I groaned as well. So after dealing with the chaos of that situation, the fellas get back on track and are finally suited up and ready to head outside. They have a bro conversation about accepting responsibility before the party is crashed by an angry and clearly infected Ferris, who talks some shit before shooting them out of an airlock. And that's when that cool frozen people section that everybody likes takes place, but also Elias dies. He and Jacob sharing a final heartfelt bro moment before he passes on. But we wouldn't want to risk letting Jacob shine in his own right for the second half, so our girl Danny shows back up to retrieve Elias's brain chip and be rude before leaving again. And at this point, as a player, you're like, yeah, we're gonna become battle buddies, aren't we? And I was really not optimistic about that, because I try not to be jaded about the state of modern writing, but it just seemed like she had all the hallmarks of the infallible girl boss who's better at everything and is always right archetype. You know what I'm talking about. But she's actually not, for the most part. She's been hostile towards Jacob for what seems like a valid reason, and when she learns that she was mostly mistaken shortly into their journey together, she just actually has humility like a human being, and they form a natural bond just like Jacob and Elias did. And I know I already praised the actors earlier, but they really do bring a strong sense of chemistry into what are ultimately really simple interactions between characters. But moving on, Jacob and Danny ball out until they're finally up on the roof and ready to call in an escape ship from orbit when the warden personally addresses them for the first time. And he's, I would say, handily the worst character in the game. Just an almost impressively generic bad guy. Like, think of the most generic villain you've ever seen. Now imagine the Great Value brand ripoff. And I think the writers were perfectly aware of it because they don't force him in our face for much time at all. He shows up at key moments, schizo posts in real time about how being super evil is actually good from the stupid perspective, and then he fucks off again. You could tell the writers put a lot more effort into Ferris. Human Ferris, anyway, because after the gang reroutes and fights through a new collection of horrors, Ferris's alpha transformation is complete, and he's here to stop Jacob for good. And, basically all charisma is sapped from the character from this point on. Once you finally stop laughing at the initial reveal, there's basically no more fun to be had. He just keeps rambling about how Jacob is gonna pay the price for his actions. That topic sure does come up a lot, huh? How weird. Anyway, during their escape from Alpha Ferris, Danny manages to get herself infected with biophage germs, which means we are so far off the rails we're not even in the same fucking zip code, but something tells me that the day can still be saved. Enter the last important character of the game, Dr. Mahler, otherwise known as the chick that stabs you in the back of the head at the start of the game. and her whole vibe is interesting. She'll play a larger role in the Final Transmission DLC, but as for the base game, you've probably recovered a handful of audio diaries of hers where she claims she was cool with doing biophage experiments on a small number of inmates secretly, but she isn't down with the warden trying to turn the whole world into them, because that's totally crazy. Yeah, she's a really shitty person, but she wants to try and do some good now, so she's gonna help our heroes create a cure for Danny. That process inevitably leads to a confrontation with the Warden and Ferris, where they act just unbelievably fucking boring. You suck so bad, Warden. But then the duo is making a triumphant run for the escape pods, and Jacob realizes there's only one. So he whips Danny into that thing and stays behind to die. And boom, those are our character journeys. There's obviously some finer details missing at this point, but to generalize, it feels like the writing is in this kind of tug of war between a less is more approach to characters and fumbling through some moral lesson or theme for them that ties into the larger narrative. Because the more subtle character moments, just people trying to make the best of a horrible situation, feel pretty authentic. I'm invested in them. And I understand why a character like the Warden would end up being a fucking cartoon, a figure that has no value outside of his specific narrative function. But while Elias's fixation on atonement and accountability makes sense given his background, it feels very ham-fisted how every other supporting character in the game begins adopting this same kind of rhetoric towards Jacob. All for the sake of signposting the big reveal that Jacob did play a hand in transporting the bioweapons that wiped out Europa at the start of the game and inadvertently led to the biophage outbreak at Black Iron. A reveal that, even though the entire game is written with the intent of making it impactful, still feels completely underwhelming. I'm not at all surprised that this narrative didn't grip people, because it's just not that grippy. The main villain is basically just a unitology cultist from Dead Space, but worse, and they completely destroyed the actually charismatic villain they did have before he was able to make any kind of lasting impact. The saving grace for me is that I happen to really enjoy the vaguely sarcastic everyman archetype in horror games, and most people kind of don't. I've been an ardent defender of characters like Ethan Winters, for example, because there's something very entertaining about a guy who shuffles past incomprehensible horrors like they're common nuisances on the way to meet his goals. And with that, I just don't have a ton more to say about the main narrative of the game. If anything, it's a detriment to the experience because the writers constantly had to stop treating the supporting characters like real people so they could be narrative tools instead. It feels like a small, forgettable subplot taking place in a far more interesting world. And we touched on the strengths of the world building a little bit back when we went over Black Iron Prison and the game's intro, but since I've harped on how unexceptional Callisto's story is, I do want to reiterate where I think the greater effort and creativity of the writing staff did go. The broader universe around the game that they reveal to you through a lot of scattered little hints could honestly have blossomed into a great sci-fi setting if this game had utilized it better and been received better. Because I'd say it's relatively easy to tell a story focusing on a tyrannical regime or megacorporation oppressing the future. That's why there's so many stories of that kind. But what isn't easy to craft is an observation on what that bigger, more detached, automated future might do to the human spirit. That's why for every Philip K. Dick, there's 100 writers cranking out fucking Hunger Games clones. And you genuinely feel the cold, uncaring nature of Callisto's world as you play. And not just because you're in a prison. I suppose you'd kind of expect that sort of atmosphere in a place like that. But you see it in every little glimpse you get into the rest of the universe as well. And this is why I feel fucking dumb for even wanting to care about this world. Because so much of the writing, the major points that they're constantly pulling your attention to, are formulaic at best. But then there's hints at something a lot more interesting scattered all over. But in the end, they're just hints. Anyway, there's the story section done. It's time to talk DLC. So outside of the collection of stylish but immersion-breaking outfits that the Season Pass includes, you're getting 2 additional pieces of content. One is Riot Mode, and the other is the story expansion Final Transmission. Riot Mode is a wave-based endless horde mode that places you in a new wing of the prison not seen in the campaign, where you need to kill bad guys in order to buy weapons, upgrades, health, and traps. You can also get additional money or perks by completing some pretty basic challenges along the way. And for what it is, I think this is kinda sweet. The main drawback of the mode is that it's designed for people who just don't have very much going on. Enemies are squishier than in the campaign, but more numerous, and your attacks are a lot more likely to cause the dismemberment of a limb. So it ends up being the power fantasy mode, with an emphasis on killing in creative or efficient ways to boost your overall score. And it's interesting how just a few minor tweaks to the existing formula makes Riot Mode feel like a genuinely unique experience to the one you get in the campaign. With ammo being far more plentiful and enemies doing a lot less damage for like the first hour of any given run, it's completely viable to play it like a more traditional third-person shooter, with melee being an effective secondary option. And I can't help but feel like if this was how the base game was balanced, it would have been much better received. I mean, it's almost impossible to overstate how hard everyone was clowning on the melee system at release. But if it were recontextualized as just a slick dodging option, with melee available to get you out of tight situations, rather than an obvious focal point, it might have made the experience a lot less unique and less tense, but it probably would have been much better received, because the gunplay in this game feels really great and punchy. Now the mode does have its share of little problems. One that I think everyone is going to notice when they start packing way more enemies into any given room is the way that most of them stand around idly while one attacks you. This was the situation in the campaign as well, and it's not really a gameplay problem per se, it's just kind of funny to see 8 ravenous monsters patiently waiting their turn. Thankfully, the big mouths and the mini-bosses don't seem to follow the one-at-a-time rule, so they always introduce a real sense of urgency. A more substantial flaw might be the lack of any real sense of progression throughout the mode. There's a good variety of unlockable perks included, but there's also a good chance that you're going to unlock them all on your very first run through the mode, assuming you already know how to play the game. At which point you can choose any 3 of them on subsequent attempts. And mixing these perks around to have a slightly different experience every run is perfectly fine, but there's nothing to unlock or work for after that outside of improving your score or highest round. I'll let you decide whether that bothers you. And like we alluded to earlier, the mode is also paced fucking weirdly. It isn't until close to round 30 that the challenge of the mode starts to turn up, and after that you might start to feel like you're in a genuine fight for survival, but it could be an entire hour of playtime before that point where things feel very casual and mindless, and the carnage of it is definitely a fun breath of fresh air at first, but it only takes a handful of runs before you're likely to feel bored with the early rounds, and you'll end up deciding that grinding through them to get to the more engaging content tucked away 45 minutes down the road just isn't worth it. All in all, I had fun with Riot Mode. I think it's a good addition to the game, and it's a shame that they're probably done updating this thing, because it would only take a small number of adjustments and maybe a level select to turn it from an enjoyable time waster into something a lot more engaging. And with that, I lied to you earlier, and not on purpose, but just because I completely forgot about Contagion Mode, which is also technically DLC, so we're going to talk about it now. Please don't get your hopes up, because what it is essentially a higher difficulty mode with a more punishing save system. There's less ammo and health, enemies are tankier, and death sends you back to the start of the chapter. Personally, I find it a little fucking whack to charge money, even a small amount of money, for a higher difficulty setting, and I really don't enjoy these kinds of modes no matter how much I like a game, so it's not something I ever would have purchased if it wasn't just kind of thrown in with the season pass. With that said, I did not beat this mode, so if someone's watching who did and there's more to it that you'd like to share, feel free to leave a comment and I'll pin you if it makes sense. And now we can finally talk about the story expansion that apparently made a handful of people quite mad. To help you better understand the context, I'll tell you what I did not tell you earlier, which is that the main game closes out on a pretty big cliffhanger. After Danny gets infected, Dr. Mahler links her core device, aka the health bar, with Jacob's, because she has knowledge of the bioweapon attack on Europa, which when transferred to Jacob, might give him the information he needs. The downside being that it completely fucks with Jacob's head and he starts hallucinating like crazy. Anyway, the rest of the game plays out like you know. Jacob gets Danny to safety and stays behind, content with dying because he feels like he deserves it. But then we get a surprise scene of a Dr. Mahler hologram telling Jacob there's another way for them to escape and she needs his help. Now, a fair number of people found this ending underwhelming, and they definitely did not care for having the quote-unquote true ending to Jacob's story concealed inside a paid expansion. And I see where they're coming from, for sure. I don't personally care about that detail any more than I care when any other game or movie or show ends on a cliffhanger in order to sell you a sequel, but I do get the complaint at the fundamental level. So without further ado, you boot up Final Transmission, and Jacob is somehow in a new wing of the prison, being called to progress by Mahler. And on the stylistic note, it's immediately apparent that the biophage takeover of the prison is at a far more advanced stage at this point. New forms of gross biomatter are spreading everywhere, and the place looks completely fucking trashed. Now add on to this that Jacob's hallucinations are only getting worse, to the point that his mind is basically creating a nightmare version of an already shitty place. And while this definitely isn't the scariest horror game out there, not even close, Final Transmission does start out feeling a little extra foreboding. But this is eventually reverted back into campy, wacky, haunted house bullshit when Jacob starts hallucinating things like hidden saw traps in the vents. Not to mention the racks of launchable saw blades that are actually set into the walls, because Glenn just couldn't help himself. Before long, you make contact with Mahler, and she gives us our mission for this DLC. Find her data drives detailing the experiments that took place here, and make it to the escape ship. Now, a little thing to note about the new gameplay, they finally added some puzzles. I mean, these little things aren't really puzzles, they're more like a speed minigame, and they're not very cool at all. But there are a couple little lever puzzles, and a couple instances where you have to use your fuses to unlock the correct path instead of just the obvious only path. There's nothing actually challenging, and I'd be lying if I said they add a ton to the experience, but it was nice seeing something new on that front. I also liked how, even in a condensed DLC package, they still included a good amount of optional areas and rooms with missable encounters. Now, to go more big picture, the pacing of the DLC is built around a very strong new enemy type, known to its friends and colleagues as the Biobot. And these things take you on a pretty wild ride. They're introduced as something so dangerous that the game tells you to sneak around and avoid them at all costs. Then a little later, one serves as a tense boss fight. Then, with the acquisition of a special new tool, they're essentially made into fodder, before receiving an upgrade that raises them back to tough enemy status by the end. And even a lot of the DLC's lore revolves around them. In a lot of ways, I think it's fair to say that Final Transmission is the story of the Biobots and Mahler's creation of them, more so than it's Jacob's story, but we'll come back to that. In terms of fight choreography, they're very fast, they love their slightly delayed 3-hit combo, and the firearms that the standard security bots have instead been replaced with a damaging AoE that erupts from their core. Once they start charging it up, it's a good idea to either start up a heavy attack to knock them away from you, start moving in the opposite direction, or put enough bullets into their midsection to shut it down. Overall, I think they're a lot of fun, and they encourage you to use the majority of the tools afforded to you by the game's simple combat system. On the design front, I think they could have benefited from a little more bio and a little less bot, because while they definitely look a little intimidating, they do not look very scary. But I don't think it's a terrible design either. All around, I'm going to grade them at a very respectable B+, because I don't think any enemy in the game has a setup and payoff nearly as satisfying, and that's including Ferris for probably obvious reasons. The DLC doesn't add any new smaller enemies, but everyone from the base game does show up at some point. Jacob even spots a two-head at the end of a hallway on one occasion, but I'm inclined to assume that that was a hallucination because I was not able to track him down. That doesn't mean there's no surprises left, however, as the kinetic hammer you've probably spotted in the gameplay is so entertaining that I'm genuinely fucking flabbergasted they never added it to Riot Mode. This is the tool that brings biobots from a boss down to a standard mob. Its heavy attack one-shots most biophages, its AoE ground pound creates space and hurts several enemies at once, and while the baton already had a very weighty, powerful feeling to it, it doesn't even compare. You only get the hammer for about the last quarter of the expansion, which makes sense from a pacing perspective, but they do make sure that Jacob gets some substantial use out of it. But checking back in on the story, now that we're nearing the DLC's end, what exactly gets covered? Well, we know that Mahler created the biobots as an alternative to the Warden's Alpha program, but she deeply regrets it now that shit's gotten real, and is doing everything she can to expose their research and actions to avoid future atrocities. And that's really about it. It's very lore-heavy and not super focused on current events. The more interesting bit is Jacob's rapidly deteriorating mind. His hallucinations become increasingly outlandish and indicative of the fact that something clearly isn't right here. This is brought to a fever pitch when he encounters Mahler, who should be waiting on the escape ship, only for her to be rather brutally killed. And then, called to him from his core device shortly after, like nothing happened. And it's been pretty generously signposted up to this point, really from the very start of the DLC, but if it hadn't clicked yet, it definitely should now that, oh fuck, none of this is real. Culminating in a boss fight against a mutated Mahler, who, from both an aesthetic and gameplay perspective, is probably the best boss in the game. She's dangerous at all ranges, there's no obnoxious gimmick, you can approach her however you want, you get to see an actual health bar, and the framing of the whole encounter is just genuinely intense in a way they couldn't quite nail with most other big fights. And your reward for besting her is learning the truth, which is that Jacob was horribly wounded at the end of the base game, and is only being kept alive so Mahler can use his core device to send Danny the information she needs to stop the Warden and his cult. It was all a fever dream, caused by Mahler feeding scary information into Jacob's dying brain. And right after the data transfer is complete, it's strongly implied that Jacob and Mahler both met their end. And holy fucking shit, did basically everyone hate this ending. And I know the whole "it was all a dream" ending is a total meme at this point, and for good reason. It's a narrative tool that's been used very poorly many times, but it's not like it was used as a cop-out here. Again, you might assume from the DLC's opening seconds, when you magically wake up in some new faraway wing of the prison completely unscathed, that this is not reality. They make it obvious enough that it shouldn't surprise or confuse anybody, is what I'm saying, and they make it make solid narrative sense and present it with some style. But I don't think we need to linger on that, because the much bigger issue people have, from what I can tell, is our man Jacob being completely fucking unable to catch a break. A very common sentiment amongst people who played the DLC is that it's mean-spirited, or that it makes Jacob's entire journey feel pointless. And I just happen to feel like the exact opposite way. It's a little unconventional with the presentation, but Final Transmission is a standard hero story. It makes a martyr of Jacob. And I love that people get so invested in characters that they want to be able to imagine them living happily ever after. That's very wholesome. But I think it's undeniable that dying for something bigger than themselves is a whole lot more meaningful. Jacob carried a lot of guilt over the part he played in the death of thousands, to the point that he was completely willing to accept his own death as a fitting consequence. It's just the cherry on top that he gets to heroically save someone else at the end of the game before that consequence comes. It's the very standard arc of redemption through heroic sacrifice. It's been done a lot better many times because Callisto just isn't that deep, but it's a super reliable and resonant character arc for a reason. And in my view, all Final Transmission is doing is turning it up a few notches. Jacob had to suffer a bit more, and the trade-off for that suffering is being instrumental in potentially saving the entire solar system from a biophage apocalypse. And while it's implied that he didn't really have a choice in the matter, based on what we know about him, I'm almost positive that's a deal he would have taken. Anyway, those are my thoughts on Final Transmission, and at this point, I guess my thoughts on the entire Callisto Protocol package. This video is long enough that I don't think we really need a long-winded outro, so I'll talk to you guys later.